Do you have any idea how far away you're going? I'm not happy with the three of you leaving me, and this suitcase is too full, John. Your dad warned you about being overweight.
Mom.
Now, you listen to your father, John Q., and be sure to write.
It's only
Do
one
you
day.
have your grandmother's address?
It's only one day from here to Holland.
Where's Holland? Across the Atlantic. Do you really need that baseball glove, Charles? And what do you know about Holland, John Q.?
Not much, I guess. Tulips, cheese, wooden shoes, windmills.
Has anyone we know been there, Mom?
Oh, the Joneses across the street. Your Uncle Sam during the war. John Adams 200 years ago. Oh, leave that glove out. In his days, it took a month sailing.
Who's John Adams, Mom?
Don't you know anything? John Adams is one of our founding fathers.
The man who with Jefferson, Franklin, Sherman, and Livingston drafted the Declaration of Independence proposed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the rebel army. He was later the second President of the United States after serving as the first Vice President under Washington. During the war with England, Adams was sent by Congress to Europe in search of support, first in France, then in the Netherlands. With Franklin and Jay, he signed the Treaty of Paris with England. John Adams was the first ambassador to the Netherlands, where he raised the loans that sustained the newborn United States. Leaving his wife Abigail at home with the younger children, Adams traveled to Europe with his two eldest sons, John Quincy and Charles. Adams, the man whose papers have been published by the Massachusetts Historical Society, volumes of his correspondence and diaries.
We lodged one night at Antwerp, viewed the cathedral and the exchange, etc., and went by Moerdijk to Rotterdam, where we arrived the 4th August. Lodged at the Marshal de Turenne, dined with Mr. Doublemint.
A banker.
Went to see the statue of Erasmus, the exchange, etc.
This is how it could have been in 1780, except then this same statue of Erasmus stood elsewhere in Rotterdam. In fact, so much has changed since the time of John Adams that it's impossible to recreate that day of August the 4th, 1780. The whole center of this important trading city was one heap of rubble and ruin after the intensive bombing by the Nazis in May of 1940. And it might have remained that way much longer than it did had it not been for the famous Marshall Plan help of the post-World War II years. But the help between the Netherlands and the United States has not all been one way. The loans that John Adams raised here then did as much for war-torn America as the Marshall Plan did for Holland in our time.
Mr. Doublemint sent his coach in the evening and one of his clerks. We rode round the environs of the town, then to his country seat where we supped. The meadows are very fine, the horses and cattle large. The intermixture of houses, trees, ships, and canals throughout this town is very striking.
First impressions of Holland by America's bluntest but most open-minded founding father. Adams spent 2 years here contacting kindred spirits, and there's no doubt he was impressed by the traditions of a country which had fought its war of independence 2 centuries before America's, a war in which Adams himself was a key figure.
Ben je erbij weer nog kerels of even? Die scheiten moeten nog zeiken. De boot gaat stons van de steiger.
No, that wasn't the Liberty Bell. That was the signal that the boat's about to leave. This was the way of getting about then. The many canals and rivers in the Netherlands were natural highways, and the Dutch talk about the trekschuit, the horse-drawn canal boat, in much the same way we talk about a slow boat to China. It can take a very long time to get where you're going. After the Peace Treaty of Paris, John Adams was promoted ambassador to Great Britain, and after years of separation, Abigail did join her husband in Europe. In the summer of 1786, 3 years before the French Revolution, they combined a diplomatic mission to the Netherlands with a sightseeing trip. And this is what Abigail Adams meant when she wrote about slow travel in Holland.
There is a silence and a dead calm which attends traveling through this country. The objects which present themselves are meadows, trees, canals, trees, and meadows. Such a want of my dear variety that I really believe an English robber would have animated me.
The Adams. John, Abigail, John Quincy, and young Charles. Probably the first tourists from the United States of America in the Netherlands. The first of millions. What makes people become tourists? John Adams used his time here between business appointments to see the sights. He saw houses where people lived and buildings where they worshipped, different not in nature from things he knew at home, but in appearance. But these people do come looking for something, and maybe it's this difference, novelty.
There, at the Keizersgracht, at number 529, is the house where John Adams lived in 1781. John Adams, who later became the second president of the United States after George Washington.
Keizersgracht 529, an ordinary canal house. Guided by the history of the Netherlands, one could well imagine it rented today to a future founding father of a nation not yet born. 200 years ago, John Adams lived there, not yet recognized except by a small but influential circle of private citizens. Seeing what's left of the past helps us understand it better. The roots of mankind are in history, for many Americans in Europe. And perhaps this is what drives them to travel, to see the famous Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, the Frans Hals Museum in Haarlem, and many other lesser-known museums in Holland which also hold fascinating stories of the origins of our liberation. The Taylor Museum in Haarlem is what some people call a museum of a museum. It's filled with scientific curiosities from the 18th and 19th centuries. The electrifying machine, designed in 1785 by a Dutchman called Van Marum, is one of its masterpieces. Over the centuries, this gigantic machine has become so delicate and fragile that no one dares touch it, let alone operate it. Luckily, the electrical department of the Eindhoven University of Technology has built an exact working replica of it. The Dutch inventor Van Marum was a friend of Benjamin Franklin. They corresponded about matters scientific. Van Marum's Taylor Society was a group of wealthy amateurs of science and matters curious, and they made many important discoveries. Now, if the humidity is low, which it seldom is here in Holland, Van Marum's electrifying machine can produce a spark of static electricity of 350,000 volts, more than 2 feet long. Van Marum's machine was more than an amateur's curious invention. It gave empirical proof of Lavoisier's theory of the elements. Electricity was to the 18th century what genetics is to us today. Something on the frontiers of knowledge. The 18th century thinker imagined electricity to be a fluid or a gas, so naturally it should be stored in a bottle. Thus you get the Leyden bottle, invented by van Mussenbroek. The Leyden bottle is the forerunner of the condenser. Van Marum and Van Mussenbroek could be called the founding fathers of Dutch electricity. Well, we're discovering a lot of founding fathers these days, so why not two more? The inventions of Thomas Edison, even of NASA, have their roots in the work of many learned and curious Dutch and other Europeans of the 18th century. You see, they had been liberated themselves from the need to work for a living by the wealth of their fathers and grandfathers. They applied their wealth and curiosity to amateur scientific societies devoted especially to the practice of a radical theory, empirical science. And the Taylor Museum derives from one of those societies, and the empirical method, working from experiment and empirical demonstration, through such people as Franklin and Jefferson, became the major philosophical principle of the new republic in North America. Just another link with the 18th century Holland of Martinus van Marum and Peter Taylor. But, like the Marshall Plan, it hasn't been a one-way street. Today, Holland makes use of American science and technology. Holland's ANS satellite was launched by NASA, and it continues. The latest Dutch-American project is the IRIS satellite, which will map the infrared stars in the heavens. Back in the 18th century, however, Holland was the leader in many aspects of science, and its Leiden University was the most famous of its time. When John Quincy Adams was sent there to study at age 14, he had plenty of advice from his parents.
You are now become resident in a country famous for its industry and frugality, and which has given birth to many learned and great men. Erasmus, Grotius, and Boerhaave, so well known in the literary world, stand foremost in the list of fame.
My son, you are now at an university where many of the greatest men have received their education. I would have you attend all the lectures in which experiments are made, whether in philosophy, medicine, or chemistry, because these will open your mind for inquiries into nature. But by no means neglect the languages.
You must not be a superficial observer, but study men and manners, that you may be skillful in both. I hope you will not let any opportunity slip, or any vessel sail which is bound for America, without letters from you.
Young John Quincy tried to impress his parents that he did take it all very seriously, and he was, it seems, a good student. But in one of those obligatory letters home to his mother, he confessed,
Honored Mama, there has been nothing worth writing, and even now I know not what to write.
But he did go on for several pages about his university and the history of Leiden, and apparently the boy cribbed much of the information from a handy book.
I am now at the most celebrated university in Europe, which was founded here for the valor of its inhabitants when it was besieged, when they were at war with Spain. It was to its choice whether to be exempt from all taxes for a certain number of years, or to have a university founded here, and they wisely chose the latter. I will give you a short description of this city. Leiden is fortified, as are all the other towns in the 7 provinces of the Netherlands, with a strong rampart of earth and a very broad canal, so that it is able to sustain a siege. The citizens are able to lay the whole country about them under water, as was done by the advice of the Prince of Orange during the famous siege which they sustained, which was in 1574.
The boy who was to follow his father's footsteps in becoming ambassador to the Netherlands, and then President of the United States, continued in this vein, including even some Latin poetry, until he abruptly came to a halt, writing,
This is all that is remarkable in this city. I am your dutiful son, John Quincy Adams.
But John Quincy did touch on one of the most important events in Holland's history, and that was the relief of Leiden on October the 3rd, 1574. celebrated here, as every year since, by free distribution of bread and herring in the old Way House here in the center of town.
Dat is vunzig. De pest als je dat nog wel doet.
In the 16th century, the Low Countries were what we would call a colony of Spain. But William of Orange, the local ruler, was getting too popular with the people. To reassert the control of Spain, stricter governors were sent and very high taxes levied on the Dutch. City after city rebelled, and a punitive expedition of Spanish soldiers besieged one after another, taking cruel and often barbarous reprisal. Leyden was so frightened after seeing the fate of its neighbors that it withstood the Spanish siege for a year, bearing up under hunger, then plague, then starvation. More than half the people died. William of Orange had the dikes broken and flooded the countryside. For fear of drowning or being trapped, the Spaniards fled. Leyden, in holding out so long, became the great example in the Netherlands' War of Liberation. The starving people of Leyden were sent relief by William of Orange, flat-bottom boats loaded with bread and herring. And every year, the first herring is eaten by the burgomeester of Leyden. And that's raw herring. But the day is also commemorated in the Pieterskerk, the church in Leyden where some people imagine that the English separatists, our pilgrims, worshipped for 10 years before sailing from Delfshaven. There is a plaque here, but in fact the pilgrims worshipped either outside or in their homes. But Leyden was the place in Europe for refugees, and the Dutch university world, not only Leyden, has long had the fame of being the second home for spiritual exiles. In the 17th century, they were philosophers like Spinoza and Descartes, religious groups like Jews, Huguenots, and the English separatists. The same spirit of hospitality and moral support which Adams found for the American cause 200 years ago lives on now for exiled students, refugee parsons, and dissidents. Not everyone in the Netherlands and in the world understands this sense of engagement of some parts of Dutch society, people who act as if they're the conscience of the world. And not all their compatriots like it. In the days of John Adams, this last opinion coincided with the interests of the Orange Party, while the Patriot Party found its adherents in the enlightened bourgeoisie, amongst the financial circles and the regents of the larger towns, people who today would be considered conservative, but then were the liberals of their time. They favored the ideas that led less than a decade later in France to the overthrow of the monarchy in the French Revolution. They welcomed Adams and the American cause.
1781. Sunday, January 14. This evening called upon Mynheer van Berkel, who was alone among a multitude of papers. Mr. van Berkel, being obliged to go out on business, made many polite excuses and invited me to call the day after tomorrow. I agreed. I then excused myself and prayed him to keep his chamber. But according to the Dutch fashion, he would accompany me to the door and make me all the bows which the custom demands, which obliged me to return him as many.
That Mr. van Berkel was the pensionary of Amsterdam, the town secretary, and very important. His brother, Peter Johan van Berkel was the burgemeester of Rotterdam, and later the first Dutch ambassador to the United States. John Adams' first act after he was recognized as ambassador from the United States was to buy a house. That was the first U.S. embassy in The Hague. But like many things of 200 years ago, that house is now gone. And I wonder what John Adams would think if he saw this. John Adams was the first U.S. ambassador. Number 47, Kingdon Gould, Jr.
It was here in the Trevatzaal of the Dutch Houses of Parliament, in this marvelous room, perhaps sitting in this very chair, that John Adams signed the Treaty of Amity and Commerce between the 13 states of the United States and the 7 provinces of the Netherlands on the 8th of October, 1782.
At 12, went to the State House, was received as usual at the head of the stairs by Mr. Van Sandhervel and Mr. de Linden, deputies from Holland and Zeeland, and conducted into the truce chamber where we signed and sealed the Treaty of Commerce and the Convention concerning recaptures.
This is the actual treaty, and as you can see, this is the signature page, and here is the signature of John Adams, my predecessor. After this first official act between the United States and the Netherlands, John Adams negotiated a series of very important loans for the United States. They were important not only because our country needed the capital, having been through 6 or 7 years of very difficult time of privation due to the war, but we also needed the psychological boost that was represented by the confidence placed in the United States by the Netherlands. But I can't help but laugh a little bit at what John Adams wrote in his own diary about these obligations. He said, "Spent most of the day in signing obligations for the United States," adding, "It is hard work to sign one's name 1,600 times after dinner," which makes me think that if it had been Ben Franklin and not John Adams who was signing all those obligations, Ben Franklin would no doubt have invented the signature stamp.
Recognition was the crowning touch for John Adams. He was received at Huis ten Bosch by the Stadhouder, Prince William V of Orange. And with his success, Adams changed a bit. The strict Massachusetts lawyer adopted the decadent fashions of European court life. He even took etiquette lessons. A few days after signing that first treaty with the Netherlands, Adams had a new assignment, another treaty to be negotiated in Paris. So he left to join Franklin and Jay there.
Began my journey to Paris from The Hague, dined at Haarlem, and drank tea at 5 o'clock at Amsterdam. Met Mr. Willink upon the road.
A banker.
Going to The Hague with a lady. He has left me a letter of credit upon Paris, unlimited. He wished my journey to Paris might have a tendency towards peace. October the 18th, Friday. Set off at 10 from the arms of Amsterdam with Mr. John Thaxter and Mr. Charles Storer. refreshed our horses at Lunen, a village halfway to Utrecht, past the villages Brooklyn, Marsen, and Zoulen.
Brooklyn, the town that gave its name to Brooklyn, New York. And I think it's odd that John Adams didn't mention this in his diaries. He also didn't mention that Haarlem, Holland gave its name to Haarlem, New York. Before it was New York City, it was New Amsterdam. But in general, John Adams was a close observer of life in Holland and the Dutch, filling pages of his diaries.
It is 8 hours, stones, or leagues from Amsterdam to Utrecht. Put up at Utrecht, at the New Castle of Antwerp, which is now kept by Oblet, who speaks English very well, although born at Leiden. The Grand Canal, which runs through this town, is a great curiosity. The paved street upon each side of it is a covered way, or rather the cover of a cellar. The cellars of the houses are all continued out under this paved street to the canal, and there are doors through which men pass from the canal under the street into the cellars of the houses, and a contra from the cellars to the canal, and the boats, barks, or scouts in it.
Adams' greatest gift may have been that he made it look so easy to obtain loans from the Amsterdammers. Jefferson, who later had to deal with the Dutch bankers, learned just how hard it was. But Adams was not the most popular founding father of the young American Republic. Witness his widely used nickname, his rotundity, pompous, short on charisma. Only in recent years have Americans appreciated the value of John Adams' unglamorous but vital accomplishments.